From Sand to Science, How Traoré's Pineapple Belt Became Africa's Biggest Agricultural Breakthrough. The order came at dawn, carried not by drums or messengers on horseback, but by radio waves that traveled across villages, markets, and fields. 100 million pineapple plants, not cotton, not sorghum, not millet, pineapples. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had spoken, and the nation listened. To many, it sounded like madness. Pineapples belonged in Ghana, in Côte d'Ivoire, and glossy supermarket shelves abroad. But in Burkina Faso, on the shifting edge where the desert swallows grass and sand mocks every farmer's hope, it was unthinkable. Yet Traoré knew what most did not. This was not a fruit. It was a line of defense, a weapon, a crown against despair. For decades, the Sahara had crept southward, consuming homes, villages, livelihoods. Experts had promised solutions, donors had spent billions, but the sand still advanced. Now, for the first time, the nation was told, "You will not beg the world for mercy. You will plant sweetness where bitterness ruled." Stay close. This story is not about pineapples, it is about dignity. Subscribe now and walk with us for an Africa that refuses to be buried in sand. When the decree first echoed through Burkina Faso's dawn, it seemed like a riddle. How could a poor, landlocked country, already battered by drought, insurgencies, and the weight of history, be asked to plant 100 million pineapples? For ordinary villagers, the figure alone was staggering. They were used to counting harvests in sacks, herds in dozens, but never in hundreds of millions. The very scale of the command forced people to stop, to imagine, and to argue. Some shook their heads, whispering that the captain had gone too far. Others, especially the youth, felt a stirring pride. Someone dared to think bigger than survival. To understand why Traoré chose pineapples, one must return to the geography of his country. The northern frontier of Burkina Faso lies where the Sahara meets the Sahel. Year after year, the sand drifts south, swallowing fragile grasslands and choking the last green oases. Traditional crops, millet, sorghum, groundnuts, struggle to survive in the blistering heat. Entire families have watched their farms vanish under dunes. Generations have known hunger as a seasonal rhythm, not an accident. Against this backdrop, pineapples seemed absurd. But absurdity was precisely what shook people awake. The pineapple is a hardy fruit. Its spiky crown shelters soil from the sun. Its thick leaves hoard moisture, allowing it to survive where other crops surrender. Its roots knit the earth together, resisting erosion and anchoring fragile ground. Ecologists call it stubborn, farmers call it resilient. Traoré saw it as something greater, a soldier in a new war. He envisioned what he called the 3 walls of sweetness. The first was ecological. Instead of trees that require years to rise, pineapples grow to fruit within 18 months. Row upon row of their spiny crowns could form a living barricade, slowing the desert's march. Their thorns deterred livestock, protecting neighboring crops. For a land constantly robbed by the wind, this was a shield. The second wall was nutritional. In villages where children's bellies swelled with malnutrition, pineapples promised vitamins, fiber, and hydration. A fruit once seen only on market stalls, reserved for the wealthy, could become everyday nourishment. Imagine the dignity of a grandmother slicing pineapple for her grandchildren, not as a festival luxury, but as daily bread. The third wall was economic. Across the ocean, global demand for pineapples was surging. Costa Rica, Côte d'Ivoire, and Ghana were reaping hundreds of millions in revenue. Why not Burkina Faso? Cotton and gold had long dominated its exports, but both came with volatility and exploitation. Pineapples offered diversity, resilience, and perhaps even pride in producing something the world wanted not as raw material, but as sweetness. But beyond ecology, nutrition, and economics, there was symbolism. A pineapple wears a crown. In many cultures, it stands for hospitality and abundance. For Traoré, it became the crown of sovereignty, a defiant reminder that even in barren soil, life could bloom. "We cannot win if we fight the desert with pity," he told his ministers. "We must fight it with imagination." The plan required the mobilization of an entire nation. Farmers were instructed to set aside strips of land for planting. Schools turned lessons into planting days, teaching children that each shoot placed in the earth was a promise to the future. Soldiers exchanged rifles for hoes, symbolically laying down weapons to defend the nation with roots instead of bullets. Helicopters ferried crates of pineapple suckers to remote hamlets, echoing past campaigns, but now carrying not guns, not grain handouts, but green life. Every institution was touched. Agricultural colleges trained farmers in spacing, mulching, and water retention. Women's cooperatives received grants to establish nurseries, ensuring that mothers and daughters became shareholders in the new economy. Youth brigades dug trenches along the frontier, their sweat falling on soil long dismissed as hopeless. For once, the state was not simply commanding from above, it was planting side by side with its people. The logistics were immense. Millions of suckers had to be imported from Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, then multiplied in local nurseries. Seeds of knowledge traveled too, from agronomists who explained that with careful mulching and zai pits, ancient Sahelian water harvesting holes, even a pineapple could thrive in dry sands. Families adapted rituals, weddings celebrated with the planting of new rows, funerals honored the dead with suckers placed in memory, a gesture that tomorrow must outlive today. Images soon appeared, drone footage of endless green rows cutting across desert sands. Radio reports celebrating crowns of sovereignty, online slogans such as from sand to sweetness or pineapples of sovereignty. Each slogan was more than propaganda. It was oxygen for a people suffocating under despair. Western experts scoffed. Development journals called it pineapple populism. Foreign newspapers ran mocking headlines, "Fruit in the Sahara, another African fantasy." But their mockery only fed curiosity at home. If grapes had been coaxed from the dust the year before, if dragon fruit had survived under Sahelian suns, why not pineapples? Doubt slowly gave way to a dangerous thing, hope. Still, beneath the spectacle lay real risk. Water was scarce, pests abundant, and markets volatile. Everyone knew the desert was unforgiving. The gamble was breathtaking not because it guaranteed success, but because it dared to gamble at all. Yet Traoré understood politics as theater. Even partial survival would inspire more than the perfect failure of donor-funded projects. If 1 in 10 survives, he said, that is 10 million crowns. 10 million fruits telling the world that Burkina Faso is alive. The vision was vast, the mobilization unprecedented. Across the land, hands touched soil not out of charity, but out of conviction that they were building a wall no desert wind could erase. The question remained, when the Sahara pushed back, could a crown of leaves truly hold the line? The desert did not wait long to answer. Within weeks of the first planting season, the Sahel revealed its cruelty. A wall of dust rose across the horizon, swallowing sky and sun. Sandstorms swept over the frontier, burying tender shoots beneath dunes. Rows of young pineapples barely rooted disappeared overnight. In some villages, children wept as they uncovered plants only to find withered crowns. Then came the animals. Goats and cattle, starved of fodder, mistook the new green for open pasture. They chewed through plots before fences could be built. Families who had labored for weeks watched helplessly as their fields were stripped bare in a single afternoon. And when the rains ended, the heat returned with merciless fury. Irrigation pipes cracked, reservoirs shrank, and seedlings died before their roots could grip the soil. For many, this was proof. "The desert cannot be tamed," they whispered. International observers, already skeptical, filed reports declaring inevitable failure. Western newspapers ran mocking headlines. "Pineapples in the Sahara, Burkina Faso's fantasy agriculture." Donor agencies smirked, relieved that their skepticism had been vindicated. But where outsiders saw defeat, Ibrahim Traoré saw theater. He understood that leadership was not measured by avoiding setbacks, but by reframing them. Every obstacle became a stage, every failure a chance to turn despair into defiance. When sandstorms buried seedlings, the captain's voice returned to the radio. He urged communities to rise at dawn and uncover the crowns of sovereignty. Villages treated it as a patriotic mission. Children, mothers, and elders scraped away sand with bare hands, chanting songs as they freed each plant. The act was exhausting, but it carried the sweetness of purpose. When goats devoured fields, soldiers marched not with guns but with thorn branches and cactus cuttings. They built spiky barricades around plots, declaring that the army now defended crops as fiercely as it defended borders. The symbolism was clear. The state's duty was not only to protect lives, but to protect livelihoods. When drought cracked the land, agricultural scientists stepped forward with ancient wisdom repurposed for modern struggle. They taught farmers to mulch with dry grasses, preserving moisture beneath the soil. They dug zai pits, traditional water harvesting holes that trapped rainfall around each pineapple's roots. They encouraged intercropping with acacia trees, whose shade cooled the ground and reduced evaporation. Each adaptation turned failure into a lesson, each setback into innovation. Behind the scenes, the first year's numbers looked grim. Survival rates hovered at 30%. But Traore had already prepared for this. If even 30 million survive, he told his ministers, that is 30 million crowns of sovereignty, 30 million fruits that will feed our people and defy the desert. By reframing survival as victory, he robbed failure of its sting. And he did not lead from palaces. Cameras captured him walking through the harshest zones, sweat mixing with sand as he bent to tend withered plants alongside farmers. These images spread across the nation, a young leader with his hands in the soil, refusing to let despair rule. For the first time in decades, people saw a president who planted instead of pleading, who sweat with them instead of sending orders from afar. The struggle itself became national theater. State radio narrated daily updates as if reporting from a battlefield, the desert advancing, the people resisting. School children recited poems about digging crowns from sand. Poets described the fight as a war of sweetness against bitterness. Musicians strummed guitars, singing verses about a fruit that would one day shade villages from hunger. The desert had struck its hardest blow, but instead of breaking the nation, it bound them tighter. Each act of recovery, each hand that uncovered a buried plant, deepened the conviction that this was not just farming, it was survival, it was sovereignty. And then, against all odds, the first signs of hope appeared. Scattered across the frontier, some plants not only endured, but thrived. Their leaves grew thicker, their crowns sharper, their roots stronger. Farmers marveled at the resilience. Months later, the impossible happened. Small golden fruits pushed through the sand. Children carried them into markets, selling them instantly. Women sliced and dried them into snacks they proudly called desert sweetness. Buyers from Ouagadougou paid double, eager to taste what had been dismissed as fantasy. Every fruit was more than food. It was proof. Proof that the desert could be resisted. Proof that the people could win. Proof that the gamble, mocked as madness, had drawn first blood against despair. The laughter of skeptics still echoed abroad, but inside Burkina Faso, something greater than pineapples had taken root. It was resilience. And resilience, once awakened, is harder to kill than any crop. The stage was set. The wall of sweetness had survived its baptism of sand and sun. But could it grow into a harvest large enough to transform a nation? The first year left scars. Many seedlings withered, fields lay half barren, and skeptics still grumbled. Yet in those scars lay the seeds of transformation. For while only 30% of the pineapples survived, that survival meant 30 million plants had taken root across Burkina Faso. 30 million crowns of defiance. 30 million reasons to believe that the desert did not always win. For ordinary families, the change was visible in the smallest of ways. A child who once ate millet porridge every day now tasted fresh pineapple, sweet and sharp against the tongue. A mother drying slices under the sun could package them as snacks, something to sell in the market rather than beg for from donors. A father who once considered migrating north for work now found purpose digging zai pits for his own land. These were not grand revolutions, but everyday victories, proof that dignity could grow in soil once labeled barren. By the third planting season, hope had turned into harvest. Survival rates climbed to nearly 50%. Wide belts of spiky green stretched across the frontier, shimmering under the sun like rows of soldiers standing guard. For the first time in living memory, villages that once stared at dust now smelled the sweetness of ripening fruit. Markets overflowed. Donkey carts and motorbikes carried heaps of pineapples into towns. Prices fell, not because demand had collapsed, but because abundance had arrived. The luxury fruit of yesterday became the daily food of today. Children chewed golden slices in schoolyards. Families drank fresh juice with evening meals. Even the poorest households, once trapped in cycles of scarcity, now tasted a fruit that symbolized plenty. Women's cooperatives seized the opportunity. They dried fruit in communal ovens, packaging it under labels like Burkina Gold. They learned bookkeeping, marketing, and export protocols. For many, it was the first time women managed businesses that supplied not just local markets but also regional buyers. Their earnings went into school fees, healthcare, and reinvestment, ensuring the cycle of poverty was not just paused, but broken. Youth brigades, once restless and tempted by migration, now built juice stalls on street corners. They mixed pineapples with hibiscus to make drinks that sold out by nightfall. Others formed startups experimenting with jams, syrups, and even wine. What began as survival had become entrepreneurship. The state moved quickly to institutionalize this momentum. Factories rose near Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso, processing pineapples into concentrate, dried fruit, and bottled juice. For the first time in generations, an agricultural revolution was not siphoned off by foreign corporations. Traore decreed that pineapple cooperatives must remain locally owned. Multinational companies were blocked from monopolizing contracts. Exports were negotiated through farmer unions, not foreign intermediaries. His message was sharp. We will export fruit, but never our sovereignty. Politically, the project reshaped identity. Burkina Faso, long portrayed as a victim of drought and donor dependency, now stood as a pioneer of imagination. Citizens who had been passive recipients of aid became active builders of a new economy. Every harvest reinforced the sense that sovereignty was not an abstract word, but something you could hold, eat, and sell. International observers, who once mocked the idea, now shifted their tone. Environmental agencies hailed the ecological benefits: stabilized soil, reduced erosion, the creation of microclimates where onions and beans could thrive in the pineapple's shade. Development economists pointed to diversification beyond cotton and gold. But inside the country, these technical victories were less important than the psychological one. Burkinabe citizens no longer whispered of survival, they spoke of abundance. Of course, challenges remained. Irrigation infrastructure was fragile, transport networks strained, and pests still threatened crops. Yet even these problems were reframed as steps in progress. To the people, the true disaster would have been doing nothing and remaining chained to despair. Planting pineapples, even with losses, proved that risk was not the enemy, but the pathway to freedom. As Traore toured regions during the third harvest, he spoke with candor. He acknowledged the failures, but insisted on celebrating the victories. His speeches carried the rhythm of a preacher. The desert fought us, yes. It buried our shoots, yes. But we uncovered them, and they rose again. Do you see these fruits? They are crowns of sovereignty, sweeter than gold, stronger than sand. Crowds roared, not because the statistics were flawless, but because the symbolism was irresistible. By now, the wall of sweetness was no longer a command. It had become a movement. Farmers planted with pride, women led businesses, youth carved futures at home. Each harvest was broadcast live, celebrated as a national ritual. Schools held festivals. Children paraded with crowns of pineapple leaves on their heads, declaring themselves guardians of the land. What began as absurdity had matured into identity. Burkina Faso was no longer defined only by suffering, but by daring. And yet, even as the fruit ripened and factories roared, one question lingered in the air. Was this miracle merely a local story, or could it ripple across Africa? If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, lift your voice in the comments. The frontier was greener, the markets richer, the people prouder. But beyond Burkina Faso's borders, eyes were watching, calculating, and perhaps even fearing. At first, the world laughed. Western donors, long accustomed to holding the keys to development, dismissed the project as theater. Reports circulated in polished offices in Paris, London, and Washington, describing the pineapple wall as impractical, unsustainable, doomed. Journalists from foreign newspapers flew in, eager to capture images of wilted plants and disappointed villagers. They thought they had their headline ready: "The desert wins again." But the story refused to follow their script. By the third harvest, when drones filmed vast belts of green shimmering across the Sahel, the mockery turned to astonishment. Satellite imagery revealed what locals already knew. The desert was no longer advancing unchecked. In some areas, it was retreating. International agencies scrambled to reframe the project as innovative climate adaptation. Suddenly, the same voices that doubted were eager to attach their logos to the success. Across Africa, the reaction was electric. Delegations from Mali, Niger, and Senegal visited the frontier, their ministers walking among pineapple rows with notebooks in hand. Could their own lands, equally threatened by sand, replicate the model? Discussions of a Sahel pineapple corridor emerged, a belt of sweetness stretching beyond national borders, binding nations together not by desperation, but by cultivation. In Addis Ababa, during an African Union summit, leaders referenced Burkina Faso as a pioneer of resilience. Traore himself raised a pineapple crown before the assembly, declaring, "This is Africa's answer to dependency." The hall thundered with applause. Meanwhile, global markets stirred. Côte d'Ivoire, Costa Rica, and the Philippines, giants of pineapple exports, watched uneasily as a new competitor rose from the Sahel. European lobbyists whispered about tariffs, warning that non-traditional producers could destabilize prices. Yet in Asia, the opposite reaction took hold. Markets in China, India, and the Gulf states welcomed Sahelian pineapples, branding them exotic and resilient. Diaspora communities in Paris and New York sought them eagerly, eager to taste the fruit of defiance. And what of the United States? Official statements were muted, but analysts began to take note. American think tanks described the project as a case study in climate-smart farming West Africa, recognizing that local initiative often outpaced donor-driven blueprints. Development agencies debated whether to support with technology and logistics or risk being sidelined altogether. For Washington, the pineapple wall raised a subtle but powerful question. Could African nations define their own agricultural revolutions without external permission? The geopolitical stakes grew larger with each harvest. What began as a gamble in one landlocked nation was now a continental conversation. The laughter had faded. In its place stood curiosity, envy, and, among some, quiet fear. The question hanging in the air was no longer, can pineapples grow in the desert? But, what happens if Africa discovers its own solutions at scale? The sweetness of Burkina Faso had crossed borders. But would it endure the weight of global politics and economic rivalry? By the fifth year, the absurd had become undeniable reality. What began as scattered patches of green had grown into belts stretching hundreds of kilometers across Burkina Faso's northern frontier. Villages once buried in despair now gazed upon fields crowned with sweetness. Yet even amid triumph, the future posed questions as sharp as the pineapple's thorns. The first scenario was hopeful. If the survival rate continued to improve, if processing factories scaled up, pineapples could join gold and cotton as a pillar of national exports. Unlike gold, which too often enriched foreign companies, and unlike cotton, vulnerable to volatile markets, pineapples promised diversity and resilience. They could sustain jobs, fuel industries, and feed children. More importantly, they could nourish a sense of pride that no tariff could tax. But risks loomed. Water remained scarce, and climate change threatened harsher droughts. Pests might adapt, striking crops en masse. Global markets, fickle as ever, could suddenly collapse or shift. For every truck leaving Ouagadougou laden with juice bottles, there lingered the fear of borders closing or prices plunging. Sovereignty demanded vigilance as much as planting. Traore framed the choice in stark terms. Africa could continue along the old path, waiting for donors, begging for solutions, and watching deserts claim more land. Or Africa could dare to gamble, to innovate with its own hands, to turn improbable dreams into tangible harvests. The Wall of Sweetness was more than an agricultural project. It was a declaration that the continent must author its own destiny. This was the deeper lesson. Planting pineapples was not just about fruit. It was about reclaiming imagination as a political tool. By asking his people to plant something outrageous, Traore had broken the spell of despair. And once broken, imagination could not easily be chained again. At community gatherings, elders began telling stories of the pineapple wall as though it were already legend. Children grew up not hearing only of drought, but of victory over sand. Women recited verses about sweetness where bitterness had ruled. Youth, once desperate to leave, now saw opportunities in farming, processing, and marketing. These cultural shifts hinted at a harvest deeper than economics, the harvest of dignity. Beyond Burkina Faso, the implications stretched across borders. If one country could transform its frontier with something as improbable as pineapples, what else might Africa achieve? Could millet belts become biofuel corridors? Could cassava feed not only villages but global industries? Could imagination itself be Africa's most untapped resource? Thus, the future remains unwritten. The desert will not surrender easily. It will return with storms, with drought, with unrelenting heat. But now the Sahel has an answer, not in pity, but in defiance. And perhaps, as pineapples continue to crown the horizon, the real question is no longer whether Burkina Faso can survive. It is whether Africa, at last, will seize the courage to define its own path, sweet against all odds. The wall of sweetness stands. What it becomes next is a choice for the continent itself. From the moment a young captain spoke through the radio at dawn, ordering 100 million pineapples to be planted, to the day when golden fruit ripened against the desert wind, Burkina Faso's journey became more than agriculture. It became testimony. A testimony that imagination is a form of power, that dignity can sprout where the world expects only despair, and that sovereignty can wear a crown of green leaves. The desert is vast and its storms will not end. Yet the sight of spiky crowns glistening in the Sahel tells another story, that resilience is stronger than sand. Families who once prayed for foreign aid now cut pineapples in their own fields. Children who once dreamed of escape now see futures in juice factories and cooperatives. Elders who once buried villages under dunes now watch their grandchildren march in harvest festivals, chanting songs of sweetness. This story is not simply about Burkina Faso. It is about a continent daring to imagine again, about refusing to be written only as victim, and instead authoring chapters of resilience. It is a reminder to every African in the diaspora that pride does not wither in dry soil. It thrives when watered by courage. And so we ask you, watching from afar, what does this mean for the future of Africa? Can boldness turn into policy? Can imagination become industry? Can sovereignty truly grow in sand? The answers may not come today, but already the fruit speaks louder than the doubts. If this story moves your spirit, do not pass silently. Like, share, and subscribe. Our ancestors planted hope, now we plant sweetness. Together we declare, Africa will rise. Say it in the comments, New Africa. Say it in pride, Africa rise. Whisper it as a prayer. It's time for Africa. For this wall of sweetness is more than fruit. It is a mirror held up to the world, showing that climate-smart farming West Africa is not theory. It is lived reality. It is proof that Ibrahim Traoré rural development initiatives are not slogans, but lifelines. And above all, it is a promise that Africa, even in the harshest soil, will not bow, but will crown itself with abundance.